actually one.
All right, let's see, are we on here? Everybody hear me okay?
No, I think it's on.
Probably helps if I turn it on. Is that on?
No.
What's this? Okay, is this one on? It's just not. There's Kurt. All right, is this one working?
No.
Where's Kurt? Looking for my trusted systems. These are Kurt. The one that's just not very loud.
Well, that one is me and it's on, right?
Okay, bear with us while we try to get the volume up.
They tried now.
Okay, how about now? Is that better? Yes? No?
No. You're projecting.
How's that?
Is this it? Right, we're in business. Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm Nancy Somerville, CEO of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Welcome to ASLA and our Center for Landscape Architecture. Since this is a design and construction-oriented group, I will share that you're in our building that we revised, did a, what's the word?
Renovation.
Renovation, thank you. It wasn't a revision, too much time writing. We renovated 2 years ago, and this renovation was designed to be LEED Platinum and Well Building Gold. Both of those certifications are in process. And while you're here, because we're well building, you can enjoy the light and really healthy air. And there's some information on it here while you're here, or Kurt Millay, our corporate secretary, who's also doubling as our only AV person tonight. Thank you, Kurt. It's also an expert on the building if you want to ask him questions about it later. But that's not why you're here. We're going to have a great event tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to Jane Frederick to welcome you from AIA. And I just want to give my thanks to Jane, to the AIA staff, everyone who helped put this together. This is an important topic, and it's great to see so many of you here. So let's get on with it. Jane?
Oh, thank you. Well, welcome to all my AIA peeps. I'm glad that you all came out tonight. We're working on a series of speeches or talks this year, which is embracing our differences speaker series to increase awareness about the diversity in the architectural profession. Many of y'all might have attended the one last month where Bill Bates was here with the president of NOMA, and I think that was a great conversation. So we're really excited about the conversation tonight with women in construction. And I'm really thrilled to see so many women in the audience, so woohoo. So thank you for being here.
Good evening. My name is Lisa Jennings. I am the manager for Career Discovery and Diversity here at ASLA, and I am happy to introduce our panelists this evening. To my left, we have Nicole Allen, who is the Chief Executive Officer for Allen Norris Permitting and Inspections. Nicole is also president of the National Capital Area National Association of Black Women in Construction. To Nicole's left, we have Jane Frederick, the 2019 AIA First Vice President and 2020 President. Jane is also managing principal at Frederick and Frederick Architects. And to Jane's left, we have our own Nancy Somerville. Nancy is the Executive Vice President and CEO of ASLA. And then to Nancy's left, we have Dr. Susan Schaefer Kliman. Susan is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Architecture and Urban Sustainability at the University of the District of Columbia. So let's welcome them.
I think I'm going to stand up for this until I get a little bit more comfortable. Allen. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Allen Norris Permits and Inspection, as well as the President for the National Capital Region of the National Association of Black Women in Construction. So that's a mouthful. And I'll also be serving as the moderator for tonight's event. I do want to get the conversation started just by allowing each of the women to give you a little bit of an introduction as to who they are, what they do. And so we'll start with Jane.
Okay. Thank you. 30 years ago, I lived here in DC, and my husband and I went to Beaufort, South Carolina on vacation, and Michael said, I could live here. So 3 months later, we lived there. And we moved because of quality of life. At the time, we had 2 small daughters, 1.5 and 3. And when Michael had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning in February to stand in line to get in a Mother's Day Out program, because they would be shot for life if they didn't get the right Mother's Day Out program, we thought, this is not where we want to live. This is not the life that we want to have. So we drove through Beaufort. It was the most beautiful place that we had seen. And we said, let's make this home. So we moved there, not knowing a soul, opened our office, and now, 30 years later, it was the best decision that we made. We have a small practice. We specialize in custom residential because when you live on a barrier island off the coast of South Carolina, you pick the projects that are the really fun ones there, and so other people are moving there to retire. So those are the fun projects, are the custom residential work. So that's what we've specialized. We have 5 people in our office. We have 4 architects and an office manager, who also happens to be our daughter, so it's a real family-focused firm, and just, it's been a really good ride. We took control of our careers at that time. We've never, I'll say not never, but rarely do we work more than 40 hours a week, and neither do our employees, because we moved there for the quality of life and we wanted to take advantage of it. So that's where our practice is. I ran for Congress in 98 and 2000, and that opened up a lot of doors for me professionally. As you can probably guess, it was unsuccessful. I mean, running as a Democrat in South Carolina, you question my sanity. But it opened up. I served on the state licensing board and involved in NCARB, and then that opened up doors in AIA. And somehow, because I stepped up to run for Congress, I'm now president-elect of the AIA. So.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not a design professional. I'm just a passionate advocate for them. So both of my degrees actually were in English and creative writing, and I serendipitously was introduced to architecture and landscape architecture way back when I was hired by the gentleman who was then, David Meeker, who was then the CEO of AIA, as his special assistant and writer. And quickly from there moved into doing government affairs, kind of became AIA's licensure nerd for a long time. And through, by the time I left there in 2000, when I came here as the CEO role, I worked through government affairs, chapter relations, continuing education, community development, and member and chapter services. And somewhere along the line there, I discovered that I really liked management. I'd already discovered that I really cared about the built environment, and it was easy to be an advocate for it. And along the way, one of my bosses said to me, you've gotten to the point you're tired of training your bosses, aren't you? And I said, that could be a point. So I found out kind of all of those things serendipitously and came here and continue to enjoy being a passionate advocate for the design professions. And I will also admit to having a very strong environmental gene, which also makes landscape architecture particularly a very good fit for me. But I've seen a lot of changes over the years. I was at AIA when AIA had its first woman president. I'm happy to see more.
Yeah,
Have
I'll be
Jane
number
here
5
with us. lots of changes over the years, a lot of them encouraging, but still a ways to go. So I think that's enough from me for now.
So this is my third time living in Washington, D.C. I actually made the alternative move, which in many ways my husband and I are sad about. So I'm actually a native of Tucson, Arizona. Spent a semester here in college, spent 2.5 years here after I graduated while I was working towards licensure. And then 8 years ago, I ended up relocating back here for work, although we actually, for the exact quality of life issues you talk about, still have our home in Arizona, and that's kind of the retirement plan down the road, a little ways away. Because of my upbringing in southern Arizona, I have always been very passionate about the environment, protection of the environment, proper utilization of resources, and have my bachelor's degree is my professional degree, but I actually have a post-professional and master's studying energy efficient architecture, and then went on and got a PhD effectively in energy efficient architecture. So 8 years ago when we moved here, after I had been running a small practice specializing in high performance architecture, running the gamut from residential to commercial, and had several employees, but when I moved here, the economy was just starting to recover, and the idea of trying to restart my practice without all the contacts wasn't as appealing as other options were, and I realized that I wanted to put my doctorate to use. So I ended up landing a position at UDC as an adjunct, and then a year later, when the position opened for department chair, was encouraged to apply, and largely because I have spent the last 20 years volunteering for AIA, for NCARB, for NAB, on a whole host of committees. I had a lot of expertise with accreditation, and UDC had been trying for over 30 years to get accredited, and so because of that expertise, I was hired, and I'm happy to say that last spring we were granted accreditation. So we are the only public institution in the District of Columbia with an architecture program. We are the only exclusively urban land grant institution, and we're the only program in architecture that's housed within a College of Agriculture. And so we get to do all sorts of cool stuff with plants. And and that's kind of my passion, is integration of landscape and architecture. So
Very interesting. So I'm completely nowhere near the field of building science or architecture and engineering. My background is actually in biology and chemistry. I spent way too many years pursuing a degree in toxicology, epidemiology, public health, and spent equally more years in a career that ultimately wasn't passion. So I think about maybe 5 years ago, I decided to come out of public sector and started to do real estate investing, and fell in love with just the process and the design and so many intricate levels of real estate, and so I ended up in that particular career field. Like I say, I have a doctorate in public health, and I haven't used it in quite a while, but I do think that I am still very much aligned with healthy living in terms of utilizing some of those practical skill sets that I've learned in terms of building science and home construction. We use a lot of environmental aspects in terms of real estate development. I work with tons of real estate developers who are doing interesting things in terms of energy efficiency. Certainly LEED certifications is one of the big areas that I have a lot of expertise in. And so I feel like I've gone full circle from looking at the human body and now identifying some of those, what do you call that? Life applications and how we live and where we live. And so that's been my transition over the last 5 years. So, all right, so I'll start off with one really big question. What is the biggest challenge women are facing in their profession today? And I'll start off with Susan.
I think that as women, we still have a real serious lack of role models at the upper levels. And there's an issue in pay that is dramatic, and I can tell you that it goes on. I just hired another faculty member, and as I was submitting a report, I was horrified to discover that he's actually getting paid more than I am at the same rank. And I'm like, how can this be? How can this be in this day and age? That apparently he negotiated better than I did or something. But so I think pay equity is a tough thing, and I think that women still struggle despite all of the resources out there to negotiate. I mean, I can negotiate really well for all my clients. I think partly because of how we're raised as women, I think it's tough. Girls and boys are raised differently, and the messages that we get make it much harder for us to advocate for ourselves. And I think that's a challenge. And I think that I've been fortunate in my career that I had some very good mentors, but they were all men. And it's really hard when you're trying to negotiate your way. And I think I've attended so many leadership workshops over the years, and women just tend to backstab. They're really competitive. Men will fight tooth and nail and then go out and have a beer together, and women never forget. And I think we don't do enough to lift one another up, and I think that's a pretty significant challenge.
Nancy, do you have any advice to share with a young woman interested in getting into the landscape architecture field or architecture in general?
Oh, absolutely. Go for it. Don't stop. Picking up on what was just said here, there is definitely a gender gap, but I have some hope and optimism for the future, and part of it is because we're having dialogues like this, and part of it is the larger dialogue, some of it horrifying around the Me Too movement, but all of that is shining a larger spotlight on the gender differences, and I know our societies and AIA and others are all really working hard at trying to educate everyone, including the men, about implicit biases and the kinds of things that we don't even realize when we're working with each other in kind of our day-to-day. So for women at any age, who want to move ahead in it, take it, get it, go. Definitely look for the women who are in roles and have gotten through kind of some of the harder times. Especially now with the dialogue that's happening, I'm seeing a great deal of openness. I'm not as familiar with the architecture profession, but certainly in landscape architecture profession, there's a lot of openness to mentoring the young women to help them bring along, and also a lot of sisterly collegiality among long-term professional women who are coming out and sharing their stories about things the troubles that they've had and the issues that they still find in working with their male colleagues in a lot of the established firms. All of you, I may have forgotten to mention this before, this is World Landscape Architecture Month, and one of the benefits for you is that you can get our wonderful Landscape Architecture magazine for free online this month on Zinio, and I mention that because there is a fabulous article in this month's issue that is looking at the stories of 4 women who are at the top of their game in large established firms, and because of the reasons of gender inequality and kind of the conditions they were facing, stepped out and started their own firms and have started this network among each other and are reaching out to others. It's a terrific story. It has a lot of kind of good nuggets in terms of kind of what you can get into, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah.
But you gotta push, you gotta go, and look for those women who've been there ahead of you. There are two on either side of me. You're in architecture and landscape architecture. We've got some fabulous role models who are of all ages, including among the young group and the more established. And they can really help bring you up and help you navigate around some of the issues that are very honestly still there.
Nancy, I would like to bring into the conversation, the AIA has recognized this, and last year we commissioned a series of equity guides. The University of Minnesota put them together. They're very rigorous, they're very good, and they're set up to help you start the conversation. So that if you're having difficulties at work, or if you want to start the conversation among a group of friends, it gives you the tools to help do that. And I think this is something that we recognize in this era, that implicit bias, that you may not know how to start that conversation to say, just because I have a Southern accent, you think I'm an idiot. That I've been told that. I don't know if it's true, but I have been told that. So, those biases that are out there.
Absolutely.
And I think the guides that we have are really helpful. We've published 3 of them. They're available on our website. And we have 6 more, if I'm correct, coming out. Is that right, Susan? So they'll be coming out this year and then next year too. So they should be very helpful. The first ones are on office culture. Bias and compensation. It's good to have a memory out there in the audience for you.
Well, this is an interesting topic. I know, speaking from the construction industry, we typically are not only underrepresented in so many different areas, but we're also undervalued in terms of our general level of competency. I know we don't typically see a lot of women out in the field or on the job site doing more strategic or scientific related work, particularly in the engineering industry. And so that's something that we're always conscious of in terms of being able to adequately represent an industry that is so heavily male dominated. So, Jane, do you have any particular instance that you can remember where you've had a male advocate for you?
Ooh, that's hard. That's hard. I can think of more instances where I have not. This one contractor that was about this tall used to call me baby, and nobody calls me baby. I'm not a baby. And it was like, what do you do on a job site when he's calling you a baby? So I figured it was just an issue on his part because I towered over it.
Okay.
So I just made it into a joke, like, nobody calls me baby but you. And we got along okay. But the other thing that was also interesting on job sites, especially in the Deep South, I quickly had to learn to talk SEC football because that was how to get along on a job site, was to be able to say, and know whose team they supported, and then to know the hunting and fishing seasons. So what the contractors, why they weren't on the job site, is because it was opening day or whatever. So that was really important. But the other thing, professionally, I've worked with my husband, so he's very supportive. So that was different in that we had a true partnership and equality there. So I didn't have, and we've had our firm for 30 years, so it's been a long time since I worked for somebody else.
Susan, do you have any comments to that?
I think I probably have more instances the other way, but I did have a couple of very good bosses fairly early in my career who really promoted women and put us in positions of responsibility. I've had several kind of disheartening conversations with emerging professionals in the last couple of years, especially the ones who are working for the larger firms that have multiple divisions, where they say they tend to get sent towards the interiors.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, how do you advocate for yourself to make sure you're not getting pigeonholed and that you get recognized? But I always worked for smaller firms, and I think that helped.
Mm-hmm.
Really kind of learned from the trenches. And I also learned, you know, when you walk into the construction trailer, you know, this doesn't happen anymore, but the construction trailer and you see kind of the sheet of dirty jokes, you know, I learned for me that by sort of laughing along with it, I earned their respect, and that helped. And you shouldn't have to do that, but I did, and I earned a lot of respect. And I think, you know, by working hard and just demonstrating that you're capable, I think that's gone a long way.
I would like to add something that you just said, Susan. I was having a conversation with the in-car leadership, and their research on people getting licensed shows what you just said, that the women are tending to not pass the test as quickly as men because they are not getting the full experience. So that's something that you really need to have a conversation with your mentor, your supervisor, that if you're being sidetracked into just doing interiors and not doing the curtain wall or the skyscraper, that's a conversation you need to have.
Nancy, you've been in this field for quite some time. What was the culture like 10 years ago?
How many years ago?
10, 15.
10, 15, well, if you roll it back even further than that, which I've been around that long, it was a little more tense. I mean, going back there, I remember when I was working at the AIA, that one of the groups that I was kind of the lead staffer on was one that was an interprofessional council. So it was also with ASLA represented their planners, and then a whole host and spectrum of engineering organizations. And the engineering culture was particularly male dominated. It's made a lot of improvements then, but I had one of those signal events that happens to women, primarily when I was the lead on something and I'm sitting with this group of other staff and their elected representatives, and I'm talking, and one of the other staffers essentially has to repeat everything I said to the elected officer that came with his particular engineering organization. I mean, that's a classic thing I read about many years later, and at the time, you know, you roll with it, and you have to. And I'll tell you one great communications lesson that gets you through that, or for anything, anytime you have a disagreement with anyone, or anyone comes at you with, you know, something negative. A terrific communications guru taught me in a group this once, is that whenever you're responding to that, one thing you do is you stop and you think for a minute, okay, what would that question or that remark sound like if it was coming from a decent human being? And you translate that, and then the other piece that goes along with it is, you know, that particular person, or the one who's challenging you, or the one who's being rude or is sexist, or whatever the thing is happening, or doesn't think you're, you know, is acting like you don't have the experience. Whoever that is probably not going to change his or her mind. It's usually his. I'll say the his or her because it can apply to anything easily or readily. But when you respond and you're reacting, you're communicating to the other people who are there. So you can just block that person out and move on and approach it as this is I'm doing this work for these others, I'm communicating this for the others, and everybody else will quickly figure out that the one or the guy or whatever it is somebody to be ignored.
And another tool with that is to say, you know, Nancy just said that. If you're in the room.
And after a while, you can even say, you know, I think I just said that.
Yeah.
But yes, and that what your point is a really good one about being supportive of each other, or for anybody who is in that position, no matter why or what they're being put in that position for. If we're advocates for each other in terms of equity and inclusion, it's going to move us all ahead a whole lot faster.
Well, a funny story, I don't know if y'all know where the term mansplaining came from, but Rebecca Solnick, who's a writer and essayist, she had written a book, and she was at a dinner party or a cocktail party in Aspen, and a man was explaining her book to her. And he had not read it, he had just read a review in the New York Times, and her friend was saying, yes, Rebecca wrote the book. And I mean, this went on for a half an hour where the guy never heard that Rebecca wrote the book that he was explaining to him. Yeah.
And not all men are horrible. Some of my best friends are men.
Yeah.
But, you know, even our best friends among women, I mean, even all of us sometimes, our implicit biases can be factoring in on how we're working with each other.
Right.
So it's about being intentional in all of our interactions, you know, whether they're personal or professional, and really being open and trying to be the active listener and hearing the perspective and what you're hearing from whoever it is who's talking to you.
Interesting. So where, if you had your perfect, what is this word? In 10 years from now, in the future, what's the one thing that can be done to improve the relationships between men and women or gender equity roles in the workplace?
I'll take it. Studies have shown that you have to have at least 30% of the minority population to be at the table to really feel like that they have a voice. And so we need to make sure that our fields represent the population of the United States, both in people of color, your sexual orientation, whatever that might be, your women, gender fluid people, just so that we can really understand and help to overcome our natural implicit biases that we, because when you have a more diverse group at the table, you end up with a better project, a better society, and a better world to live in. And we are creating the world for people to live in.
And firms with women, or in any kind of business where women are at the table, have, or what is it, 15% more productive? Is the stat. So I would say, to get us to that better future in 10 years, the dialogue has to continue. It can't stop and drop off, because it's just too easy for people to kind of fall back into the old ways. And while continuing the dialogue kind of helps to teach people kind of a few things that they can take forward to do a better job. For instance, there's stats that say that, okay, firm is interviewing for a position, maybe that they need more gender representation, or maybe they're looking for other minority representation. If they interview at least 2 of whatever's missing instead of just 1 for that position, the chance of them actually hiring whatever's missing is way higher than if they just do 1. And so, when people kind of start to learn those things and start applying them, one of the things that I learned at a forum on women in the environment 4 or so years ago was, you ask people and look at salary history when you're hiring people, you're automatically going to be really reinforcing gender inequality. So we immediately took it out and went, okay, that's it, it's off, it's not on our applications, it's not on what we ask for, and we look at what the job is about, and we find the candidate we want, and then talk about what we can offer. And it's things like that. And if you don't know that that kind of the old ways of doing things that tend to kind of create the same inequitable system, then that will go on. So continuing the conversation, trading that information, getting it out broadly, and then supporting each other.
Yeah, Nancy, along those lines, I'm sure all of y'all have read about how with orchestras, when they have blind,
Exactly right.
what do you call them? Auditions.
Yeah.
That a lot more women and people of color
Yes.
are hired
Yes.
because the biases are
Yep.
taken out of the equation. So, I don't know if y'all have read, Daniel, Canahan's, is that his last name, that wrote about, fast and slow thinking. It really covers that really well on how to make decisions to remove your natural biases.
Susan,
Well, and I
can you
think
wrap
that
up?
we really need to be taking a look at the profession and trying to figure out how to make it more hospitable. Because the number of women who depart, my class, in college was 50% women. And that was not the case ahead of me or behind me, but my class itself actually was 50% women. And so we were starting to see a change at that point. But it's not reflected in the profession. And I can't tell you the number of young women who I've talked to over the years with all my AIA involvement and committee involvement who kind of get disillusioned, they want to start families. And we haven't seemed to adapt, to figure out a way, how do we make the profession a little more flexible so it's not, so there actually is a work-life balance. And then we are actively promoting women and getting them into those leadership roles and figuring out a way to make it work. For me, it's, and I would agree with exactly what you said, 10 years from now, we shouldn't be talking about architects of color. We shouldn't be talking about women architects. I don't consider myself a woman architect. I'm an architect. My gender shouldn't make a difference. This color of somebody's skin shouldn't make a difference. And it drives me crazy that it does. Because if you're competent, you're competent. And it doesn't surprise me to hear you say that women-owned firms are more productive. I once had a boss tell me that if he'd given the choice, he would always hire a woman over a man because he knew that in order to prove herself, a woman has to work twice as hard.
Right.
So if he hires a woman, he knows he's going to have a more productive
And he doesn't
employee.
have to pay her as much, too.
Right.
What a deal.
Yeah.
So how do we bridge that gap? You see them, you see women being educated, you see the interest there, but you're not necessarily seeing represented in leadership roles and in the workforce. What are we missing here? You mentioned work-life balance. I know that's a very important issue. So,
One of the pieces that came up in that article that I mentioned, I really encourage everybody to go read. But one of the women who now leads her own firm and stepped down as principal of a big firm to do that, one of the things that she said and that she noticed and the others agreed with was that over the years, the men in the firm came to be looked at as the designers as they were kind of growing up, and the women were looking as design support. And that what they wanted to bring to the table, particularly things regarding being kind of more mission-driven or public-oriented, and the interest in listening to that kind of diverse voice kind of got blotted out, where the other folks kind of had that, they had their voices in, and the women just weren't being listened to. And sometimes it was in firms that had been more open and then kind of had a change of leadership and that bias that kind of listened to the guys but not hear the women as well, thing would kind of start creeping in. But there is definitely, the stats are still showing there is that drop off. In the landscape architecture profession, the schools have been about 50-50 for quite a long
It's about the
time.
same for architecture.
And our membership it's better among the emerging professionals, but if you look at the full membership, they're about 35% women. When you start looking at the leadership of the firms, it starts dropping way down. And coming to this panel tonight, I did a quick look on our website and kind of looked at who were winning the highest medals, and there were only the 2 highest medals. 3 of the last 10 were women, and 1 and 2 in the last 10 the other one. And the stats just continue to get more rarefied as you go up, and that somehow we've got to make that change.
interesting. Do you seem to notice any value in really putting together opportunities specific for women in order to increase participation or to grow leadership capacity in firms?
Well, I could like to address that. Last fall, AIA San Francisco has Equity and Diversity Conference, there were people from all over the country that wanted to be there and participate in that. So that showed a real hunger for doing that. And then every other year we have a Women in Leadership Conference, which grows, I guess it doubles almost every year. So this year it's going to be in Minneapolis on my 60th birthday. So that'll be fun. September, well, actually, 13th and 14th, is that? Yeah. And that has grown every year, and that is really a good opportunity to network with other women, and there's a good range of, we'll call us seasoned women, and emerging professionals, so that opportunity to mix together is really important, and we're seeing a huge hunger for it, because whenever we have an event like that, we have a good turnout.
I think the challenge is getting the younger women to that event. Again, getting the bosses. I think we need to, the AIA's large firm roundtable is making a concerted effort to deal with diversity.
Right.
And they've been working very closely. Interesting little factoid that of the architects of color, more than 60% of them got their degree from an HBCU. And so those of us who are involved in HBCU said, well, if you really want to change diversity, you need to be talking to us to be recruiting. And so there's been a concerted effort, but I think we need to be looking at this from a gender perspective as well, and a sexual orientation perspective. I mean, in order to have our profession be reflective of the population as a whole, we need to figure out where do we go for the sources, how do we tap into that, how do we really make sure we're providing the leadership opportunities and the proper mentorship.
And I can say from the construction perspective, it's always interesting when you look at developing partnerships with those organizations who has the capacity to provide diversification in your workforce. And that's been one of the huge benefits for our organization. There's a National Association of Women in Construction, which is a largely white organization of women who are in the construction industry. And so we've been able to really work together to develop opportunities and resources that not only benefits the women who work for organizations, but also the small entrepreneurs, which we primarily serve. So that's been a great partnership and building that relationship. In terms of your chosen careers, where do you see the future in terms of architecture and landscape architecture? We're in a green LEED Platinum building today with green rooftops. Do you see more of that here in the district or nationally?
Absolutely. Climate change is real. It is a huge focus for the profession and for ASLA. It's something that we're going to be working on for the next 50, 100 years. Hopefully not that long, but might have to. And that's critical. And so a lot of the change there is really around the dialogue and increasing acceptance of what we need to do to build more resiliently, because kind of the old paradigm of how we built, really the pave the planet approach, it's not a great idea. It not only contributed to climate change, but it sure isn't resilient when you're getting extreme weather events. So learning, kind of how to do the new, make what we know are the better ways the new normal is a major challenge for us. And we're seeing now landscape architects really getting into very large-scale coastal resilience projects and really looking at resilience and climate adaptation at a much larger and longer-term level. We need to see more of that happening, but it's making a big difference, and there's a major change happening in that.
And that's something that the AIA is completely focused on too. I mean, the board made the decision in January that was going to be our, eagle eye focus is on sustainability and resiliency. And one of the ways that we're going about doing that is that we are working with mayors, because they really are on the ground, making things happen, and they are hungry for our leadership. I don't know if many of you were at Grassroots, but we had a mayor's panel, and the mayors, it was the president of the U.S. conference of mayors and the president-elect, and they were saying, we need you. We need you to be involved in our cities. So that's an opportunity for architects and landscape architects to really start making a difference in our communities and how we can green the planet.
And are we seeing this from the university, Susan?
Well, certainly my university is very much involved in that, and I know that NPAR was looking at it, the Architectural Review Forum, which is happening this year, which is going to determine the course of education, that's been a focus.
We talked about it today.
So I know that the committee that I served on for NPAR this past year, we actually wrote a position paper for the board to take to that, to try to get it incorporated more, and really get it embedded in the curriculum much more deeply. But I know that certainly the folks that I'm talking to, and maybe it's just because that's my area of interest, those are the people that I tend to network with, but I think it is getting embedded in the curriculum fairly broadly.
Today I was at a meeting with the 5 presidents of the collateral, so that was NCARB and NAB and the professors, ACSA, and the students. And we talked, we had a presentation about greening the zoning code. And there's a whole group working on that, on how we can have a model zoning code that you then can take to your town, to your mayors, that will help sustainability and resilience. So that's another avenue to get into it too. So that was really important.
And there is some work being done by the International Code Council, particularly surrounding green codes and energy review codes. I know here in the district as well as other jurisdictions that really pushing for more stringent requirements in terms of residential and commercial development. So that's certainly something that I can see being implemented within the next year or two.
And one other thing we're seeing along those same lines is an increasing focus on environmental justice, because it is the already disadvantaged communities, which are very often communities of color, that don't have the resources that are most in harm's way for what's coming along with the impacts of climate change. So that has to continue to be a really important focus for the design professions moving forward as well.
Interesting. So what is the most critical challenge that you're facing right now?
I think we were just talking about it.
Okay. What effects has specific technology made on your field or your industry?
I would say advancements in computer software. We've seen tremendous changes with building information modeling, energy modeling, the integration of all the different software packages that has allowed for better visualization from clients as to what they're getting, for better integration of the documents from the various, no building gets designed by one person, it's a team, it's a whole series of different disciplines and ever more specialized disciplines, and a lot of the software that's out there is allowing for a better collaboration and clash detection, but to make sure that the documents are coordinated, which then ultimately helps the construction process go more smoothly. And so I think that's really right now what we're seeing. But and what that's doing is it's actually, because a lot of the software requires you to really understand what you're doing. There's this concern that computers are going to take over the world and that pretty soon there's not going to be any need, but it's actually those who are trained, particularly in architecture, an architectural education is training you to be a problem solver, to look at things in a different way. And so the ability to do that and to guide and to lead is absolutely critical. That's something a computer cannot do. And so I think the ability to have that with the technology is really having a tremendous impact on the profession.
I'll add on, I completely agree about the technology, and that includes the GIS data and the ability to really incorporate multiple data sets from all kinds of sources that we didn't have before, and what you are then able to do really to better inform what you're doing, and even the effect of social media and being able to crowdsource, crowd knowledge about design and everything involved with that as well. There's a lot that's available, and Also the performance monitoring piece of it, there's much more of that happening in all the professions, and that enables, you know, the professions to move ahead faster in terms of adopting best practices and continuing to raise the bar in terms of performance.
One thing that the AIA is doing is we have a research agenda now. It has been years since we've had a researcher on staff, and so we're really looking at what information, facts that help us design better. And so that's really an exciting thing to add to it, that it's not just anecdotal, but it's true knowledge that we're building on.
So what are some of the more interesting trends that we're seeing right now?
She wants questions.
All right, so that was the last question, so I guess we'll open it up for the audience to have questions.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So thank you very much for bringing this discussion to all of us here tonight. I have a question that's, well, maybe it's not a rhetorical question. Do you think that your working experience and exposure to world design, do women, if we're in a leadership position, make a decision, but do we design or approach design solutions differently from men based on our experience as mothers and because, you know, all the things that women are a little different? Just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I can definitely say that in my experience with residential construction, that is very much the case. That, you know, I hate to generalize, but I've had multiple situations where particularly younger male designers who got handed projects because they don't spend 90% of their day in the house. Little anecdote, we're doing a renovation, final piece of our multi-year renovation in our suite right now. And we're putting in, we've got a little, what used to be a janitor's closet, and there was a refrigerator that was in there, and I said, you know, with this last phase, can we just put in a little sink so that I don't have to run to the public ladies' room to watch my coffee mug out? And so one of the other people sharing this feed said, yeah, you know, and if we could get a shelf for the microwave, that would be awesome. So we have a fairly young male architect who actually is not even licensed, who's running the project, who, you know, I basically handed the drawings and just said, just draw, because this is a university project, so we're not allowed to do our own drawings, even though 100% of our full-time faculty members and over 50% of the adjuncts are licensed. But we can't do our own drawings. So I handed the sketch, just do the construction documents, give us this is what we want. So about a week ago, because they then gave me some samples and said, pick out the finishes, tell us what colors you want. And I looked at the drawing and they put in a Corian shelf to support this microwave. And I said, why? Why Corian? And then I started looking at the construction detail, and then I noticed that because of ADA, the counter had to be at 34 inches, okay. And the shelf, which was the full depth of the base cabinet, was mounted at 48 inches. I said, all right, so 48 minus 34 is 14 inches, and it's 24 inches deep. You're never going to be able to use this sink. And, you know, the architect's not involved in construction administration, and we've got a bunch of engineers who are project managers on campus. And so I, as the architect, have to keep walking by, and every time I see something that wasn't built right, I'm sitting there going, anybody who's ever used a kitchen sink would realize that that wasn't going to work. How did that even ever get drawn that way? And I've actually observed that in multiple instances in residential construction where there's just sort of a lack of understanding of the day-to-day use. And so, you know, it maybe doesn't happen quite as much in the detailing on the larger commercial projects, but it is something that I've observed in my career.
I would say in the landscape architecture profession, from what I've heard from the women designers, the answer is an unequivocal yes. That there is a different perspective, and a lot of it has to do with how women see and use space that's a little bit different than how men approach it. So that's a perspective that's not added unless they are there and part of the conversation.
Well, I think that's why it's so important to have a diverse workforce, so that you have all those perspectives at the table.
I have the next question. In my work experience, I found that there were young women that were quiet and were waiting to be acknowledged for their capabilities, and there were other people, both men and occasionally a woman, who were outspoken and were able to move along faster. And I wonder if any of your experiences were like one or the other. Were you acknowledged along the way, or did you have to learn to speak up and self-advocate in order to get where you are?
I had learned how to speak up. I mean, that was a really good example. I think it's one of my very first jobs. My boss was a great guy, a lot of fun. We played bridge at lunch every day. We would do the Ouija board after we went and measured old building to see if we brought any spirits home. But you're probably guessing he wasn't a very good businessman. And it had gotten to the point where I had not been paid in 6 weeks. And this is not good. So I got to the point, I think I was maybe 23 or 24 years old. I would collect the mail, and if there was a check from the client, I would get my boss to sign it over to me, which you could do in those days. I don't think you can do it now. And I look back on that and I think, wow, I did that, so yeah, I learned to look out for myself a little bit, yeah.
And yes, you kind of have to do that, and I certainly did. I'm an incredible introvert, and although in my day job I need to be extroverted and a lot of the time, but I did find over the years and kind of learned how to do it to be a little bit more vocal proponent for myself. Part of it was I got really tired of people who didn't know as much, taking the stage, and that's kind of had to elbow my way in and add my piece. And,
I can certainly say in construction, I've seen it, where, again, I generally, especially if I'm on a construction site, I'm already discounted as being lost, or dropping off lunch for someone's husband, just any of the such. So I've learned to be a very loud person, and that really just comes with being confident and understanding, being knowledgeable of my craft. And so I've had to certainly make myself be, I'm an introvert as well, so I have to make myself be more outward in order to be recognized as a profession. So.
But I'll pick up on that too. Another thing is that part of being inclusive is also being aware that people are built differently in terms of extroverts and introverts, and making sure that there is space and accommodation and inclusion for those kind of different communication styles and personality types as well.
Yeah.
And I think that, so I am like a 10 on the extrovert chart, so that's an issue for me. But one of the things that I've made an effort to do when I had employees is to try to recognize the introverts and to try to nudge them a little bit, and try to really make sure that I'm recognizing everybody in the office for their talents and not just listening to the ones who tend to speak up more.
I'm so sorry, we don't have any more time for questions, so can we get some final thoughts perhaps?
Final thoughts? Well, thank you so much for the invitation to this event. It's certainly been interesting, and I think we've all gained valuable information and knowledge from the